That's one reason I wanted to talk with President Biden. He's been so public about the pain of loss he's experienced, and he's managed to stay engaged in the world. He isn't the only president, of course, to have experienced terrible tragedy, but none have been willing to share so much about it publicly, particularly when they were in office. More than 15 U.S. presidents have lost children. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Thomas Jefferson all lost 4 of their kids. Jefferson was said to have carried a lock of hair belonging to one of his deceased daughters all his life. Abraham Lincoln watched 2 sons die. His 11-year-old, Willie, died in the White House, likely of typhoid. His funeral was held in the East Room. John F. Kennedy also lost a son while serving as president, a newborn named Patrick who only lived about 39 hours. Both Roosevelts experienced the deaths of children, as did Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. His 3-year-old daughter Robin died of leukemia in 1953. President Biden's first wife, Nelia, and their 13-month-old daughter, Naomi, were killed in a car crash in 1972. His young sons, Beau and Hunter, were badly injured. Beau died of cancer in 2015. The White House had set up 2 chairs for the president and I to sit in, facing each other at some distance in the library of his residence. It was a standard setup for a standard interview with the president, but it seemed too formal to me, so I asked if they'd bring a table we could sit around, something we could lean forward on, and if the president was so inclined, talk more intimately, face to face. They brought a table in, we arranged the microphones, and then the president appeared. We shook hands, he sat down, and we began to speak. I know you're reluctant to talk about your grief publicly because people have suffered worse, you've said, and you've gotten support that other people haven't gotten. And I know that given all that's happening in the world and all the suffering that we're seeing, it may seem trivial to talk about one person's suffering, but I do think it helps people to hear from others who have survived grief and lived with grief, as you have. And I know it's the only thing that's really helped me. So thank you for doing this.
No, I'm happy to do it. Look, one of the first things I learned after I got that phone call when I was down here,
1972,
and I got a phone call from the fire department at home in Delaware. And they put a young woman on the phone, one of the first responders, and said, "You got to come home, there's been an accident." And I said, "What's the accident?" They said, "Well, your wife and 3 kids were hit by a tractor trailer, and you should come home." And the poor kid, she was a young woman, said, "Your wife's dead, your daughter's dead, and your boys are really hurt."
Your daughter was 13 months old.
Yeah, 13 months old. My boys were not quite 3, not quite 4. They're a year and a day apart. And I just remember, like a lot of people feel, I think, I remember walking out through the Capitol and looking up at the heavens saying, "God, why'd you do?" I was angry, like I was talking to God. I know it sounds strange, but I was really angry.
You were just 30. You'd just been elected to the Senate. You'd fallen in love with this woman on a beach in the Bahamas. Nelia was her name, and Naomi was your daughter.
Yep.
Did you know how to grieve at that time?
Well, I won the gene pool. I was raised by a mom and a dad who were... my mom was a person of faith. My dad was a guy who had been through some tough times and just got up. The saying in the family was, just get up. Just get up. And when you get knocked down, just get up. And I had the great advantage because when it happened to me, I had a whole family. My deceased wife and I had purchased the home. It had a barn. My brother moved in and turned the barn into a little apartment. My sister and her husband left their place and moved in with me to help me raise the kids. And we have an expression in our family: if you have to ask, it's too late. I mean, for real. Mm. And they were there, and my mom lived, and my dad lived, but...
You wrote about that time. You said you felt trapped in a constant twilight of vertigo, like in the dream where you're suddenly falling, only I was constantly falling. And you went on to say, "I began to understand how despair led people to just cash it in, how suicide wasn't just an option, but a rational option." Did you actually feel that? Did you actually think about that?
Well, I didn't. I thought about, I could understand how people could do it. I didn't contemplate it per se because I had 2 boys that needed me.
You wrote that you looked at them when they were sleeping and you said, who would explain to my sons my being gone?
That's true. Because look, you could see how people, when they've been to the top of the mountain, had everything, their life was like wonderful, and everything gets crushed, how they could say, I'm never going to be there again, so I don't want to do this anymore. But, one thing I did do, I'm the only Irishman I've ever met that never had a drink. And I had actually gone downstairs in the house we were still living in, the boys and and I'd take out a bottle of liquor and put it on the table and say, I'm going to drink it, I'm going to get drunk. I never took a drop, but I'd stare at it and, just how do you escape?
There was a Senator McClellan, was his name, who had lost a number of his own kids, and he advised you to bury yourself in work.
Yep.
He said to you, work, 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 work.
Yep.
I buried myself in work much of my life for this reason.
Well,
but did you do that or did you not?
I did that in the sense that I didn't want to stay in the Senate. I was going to leave, and I had my brother talking to the governor about a replacement for me.
You were criticized at the time for not spending more time in Washington, for going home every night to be with your boys.
But I did. Every single night I got trying to go home because I wanted to kiss them goodnight. And every night, no matter what time I got home, sometimes it was late, they'd be in bed. I'd climb in bed with each of them individually.
That was 51 years ago, and my dad died when I was 10 years old, and my brother when I was 21, and I still have a hard time talking about it. And I wondered, 51 years later on, is it something that's still, do you think about it every day still?
I got really lucky. No man deserves one great love, let alone 2. My youngest brother set me up on a blind date 5 years after I lost Nelia and Jill. And I had to ask her 5 times to marry me, but I literally... But my boys were in good shape. They were coming along. And again, I had just an incredible family. I told you the expression of the family was just get up. You get knocked down, get up. And I heard one of your podcasts about how you started unpacking boxes and how difficult it was.
Yeah, I've been going through my mom's boxes still. They're all in my basement still.
Well, I get that one because I purchased this home that we loved, and it was a neat house. We loved it. But every time I couldn't take any more opening the closet and smelling the fragrance, or walking through a room and having a memory, or packing up the clothing. I mean, that was really, really hard. And so I decided that we're just going to sell the house, going to move. And we did. But it was a really difficult time, because it was all still so raw. Fast forward, about 10 years later, I built a home. And I built it on a pond, and across the pond was the woods. I remember if we had a fundraiser for my campaigns, we'd do it at my home. And my dad would come, and we're standing out in this back porch looking over this pond. And I didn't think I was being maudlin. I said, I wish Nelia could have seen this, because she lived up in the Finger Lakes, and Lake Skaneateles loves the lakes. And my dad went up to the local Hallmark store and came back with a framed version of Hagar the Horrible.
The old comic book.
The old comic book. And the Viking with his ship. And there's 2 frames in it. One where his ship gets struck by lightning and he's standing looking up at God and saying, "Why me?" And the next frame is a voice from heaven says, "Why not?" My dad handed it to me and said, "Don't forget it, honey. Don't forget it." My mom
had experienced a lot of tragedies in her life, and witnessing the death of my brother in front of her, she would never ask why me. She would always say, "Why not me? Why should I be exempt from the suffering of others?"
Your mother was ahead of me, because it was, and I was my dad, though, you can't feel sorry for yourself. So many other people go through so much more than you've gone through. He never said it that way, but it was like, why would you be exempt?
You and I had both spoken to Stephen Colbert about grief. He was on the podcast. And one of the things he said to me, he said, people are afraid to talk about grief because they think it's a trap of depression. He says, grief is a doorway to another you because you're going to be a different person on the other side of it. Do you feel like you're a better person because of the grief you've experienced?
Well, that would be presumption of me to say I'm better or worse, but I'm slightly different. I find myself focusing on the things. Probably the best things ever happened to me was one of the worst things. When I was a kid, I stuttered badly, like that, and I was the run of the litter too. I was always the little guy, and I used to hate the fact I stuttered. It was tightened me up so much having to read aloud in school or those kinds of things were really hard. But I realized it was a great lesson I learned because everybody has something they can't fully control. Everybody. And so it turned out to be a great gift for me that I stuttered. I think the upside of going through what I went through is making me realize that there's so many people out there who've gone through so damn much, and they have none of the kind of help I had. I mean, I really think, Angela, I think there's a lot of heroes. Get up every morning, put one foot in front of the other, and don't know how the hell they do it. Don't know how they do it.
We're going to take a short break. We'll have more of my conversation with President Biden in a moment. Welcome back to All There Is. Now, more of my conversation with President Joe Biden. You talked about the stuttering as a gift. It's interesting because Stephen Colbert also, one of the things he once said to me, which really struck me, he talked about a realization that he had that he was grateful for his grief. And he quoted a line that J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer, wrote, saying, "What punishments of God are not gifts?" And when I asked Stephen if he really believed that, he said that yes, and he explained that he had gratitude for the pain of grief.
It doesn't take the pain away. It doesn't make the grief less profound. In some ways, it makes it more profound because it allows you to look at it. It allows you to examine your grief in a way that is not like holding a red-hot ember in your hands, but rather seeing that pain as something that can warm you and light your knowledge of what other people might be going through.
Do you feel grateful for your grief?
No, I don't feel grateful for it, but I feel that it's given me an insight. Look, I was raised...
An insight into other people.
Yeah, and I was raised in a family where you were expected to reach out to people. It wasn't something you had to go through something horrible. I remember I joke that, I learned my values at my grandpa Finnegan's kitchen table up in Scranton when he used to say, "Joe, remember, you're a man of your word. Without your word, you're not a man." And he'd talk about how he lost his son, Ambrose Finnegan, in the war. And he'd talk about all the good pieces of him and why he was so special and how the family stuck together. And, and my dad went through some tough times, but my dad just got back up. And so...
That was the ethos in the family.
Yeah, no, it really was. And it was throughout the family.
Just this past year, I've kind of had what I consider kind of an awakening to this grief that I buried very long ago when I was very young, when I wasn't able to deal with it as a little boy. I still feel overwhelmed, almost on the verge of being overwhelmed by it. And I'm wondering, do you ever still feel overwhelmed by grief?
I do, as it relates to my son, Bo.
He died in 2015.
Yeah, he had been in Iraq, unfortunately, for a year next to one of those burn pits, and he got glioblastoma, brain disease.
He was 46 when he died.
Yep. But when he came home, it was clear that it was a death sentence. It wasn't a question of if, but when he was going to die, how long it would take. But I think you have to find purpose beyond your pain. And for me,
you have to find some meaning to get you through.
Yeah, something to keep you completely engaged. And I had two things. For example, every single day, I talk to every one of my children and grandchildren who are alive. I mean, literally, I text them every single day. I talk to them. The thing that saved me and Jill with Bo was the fact that we have these kids and you just keep reaching out, you keep touching them. I know you have 2 children now, but I mean, they were my salvation. They were, you know, they'd...
And even when Nelia died, you've said that it was Bo and Hunter, little kids at the time, that saved you.
Oh, absolutely. I remember riding, we were in the car, Hunter was, I guess, 5 years old, 6 years old, and we're riding along and the top was down. In those days, you could put a kid in your lap. I know my lap, I should.
I remember those days. It was crazy.
And we stopped at a stop sign, and we were in the country. And he looked up, and he looked out, and all these cows around grazing. He looked, he said, "Daddy, I love you more than the whole sky." The whole sky. And, you know, I'd get home, and they could tell, too, when I was down. And they'd just be there.
In your book, your last book, on the back page was a beautiful photo of Bo when he was 8 or 9,
yeah.
And he's turning and he's waving to the camera. And you said somewhere that that's the age you always see him in your mind's eye. And I'm wondering, is that still true?
Yeah, it is. He had a smile on his face, just waving. He's walking into the garden. And look, Bo and Hunt, they finish each other's sentences. They are the closest they could possibly be. And I think the loss of Bo was a profound, profound impact on Hunter. But when Jill and I got married, she was just totally embraced by them. Everything we've done, we've always done as a really close-knit family.
We were talking about being overwhelmed at times, and you brought up Bo, and I'm wondering. I read a book by Evan Osnos, who wrote a book about you, and he talked to a couple of people who knew you, and some of them said that after Bo's death that they saw a change in you, and one person said it was almost physical. You could see it in how he stood. He wasn't the old college football player anymore. He emerged as this sort of humbled, purposeful man. And I'm wondering, how do you think Bo's death altered your sense of yourself?
Well, I think it made me a little more fatalistic. It also caused me and Jill enormous pain because he should be the one sitting there talking to you, Bo. He was a better man than I am, and so was Hunter. Both boys were always looking out for me, taking care of me. If they thought I was getting down, they'd, "Hey, Dad, come here, we're going to do boom, boom, boom."
You've talked about how Bo made you promise you weren't going to turn inward and that you weren't going to step back from all the things that you devoted your life to. And I'm wondering, how do you do that when you feel like your heart is taken away from you? How do you not turn inward? Because I turned inward when I was a little kid, and I'm not sure I've ever emerged from that.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Jill and I went home on a Friday night to see Bo. We didn't have much time left. He wasn't in the hospital bed, but it was clear with the diagnosis of Reed. Anyway, he said to his wife, "Would you put the kids to bed? I want to talk to Dad." He said, "Dad," he said, "look at me, Dad." And there's this tradition, I don't know where the hell it came from in our family. He said, if you want someone to look at me, Dad, and he pointed to us, "Look at me, Dad." I said, "I'm looking at you, honey." He said, "I want your word as a Biden. Promise me you'll be okay when I go." I said, "Bo, I don't want to talk about it." I said, "Dad, promise me. I know you, Dad. You're going to want to quit. You're going to want to go in. You're not going to want to do it anymore. Dad, promise me you will not quit. Give me your word, Dad." I said, "Bo," I said, "Dad, give me your word, Dad." And I made a promise. He knew me better than I know me, and he knew my instinct would be just turn inward.
Do you still feel him with you?
Oh, I do all the time. I ask myself, I promise you, I ask myself all the time, what would Bo do? A difficult decision.
But do you literally feel him?
Yes.
I mean, in good days, I feel people I've lost with me, but there's a loneliness to grief, I find.
There is. But look, I had an advantage. I still had Ashley and I still have Hunt. And I'll get calls from my daughter and my son saying, Dad, how you doing today? Everything okay? Good, doing well? I mean, it's constant contact.
Do you feel alone in your grief still at all?
No, because I think that Bo's death was even more profound for Hunter and for Ashley. They were like one person. I mean...
You're wearing Bo's rosary right now.
I am, the Sort of Lady of Guadalupe.
It's interesting. I talked to a palliative care doctor named B.J. Miller, and he said to me that the loneliness so many people feel in grief is itself a bond, and that maybe people can come to see it as a communal experience. There's a communal experience in that loneliness, ironically.
Well, there is, at least in my family, and people who are really close to Bo. I mean, we'll be sitting there sometimes, not having talked about anything, and all of a sudden, you know, my daughter will say, you know, remember when Bo did that? We were at the beach, and remember that time Bo did boom, boom, boom?
And you're able to tell those stories.
Yeah, I think because we forced ourselves to do it, and now it's kind of like a glue that holds us together. I mean,
it's beautiful.
Well, it really is. I mean, Bo's 2 children. I'm with them. We're with them all the time. I mean, you know, Natalie's turned out to be such an incredible kid. She's happy. She's doing really well. His son's a handsome young boy. Every single Thanksgiving since before Bo passed away, we go to Nantucket because that's where Bo liked to go as a family. And all of us together, because it's just the memories.
That's his place.
Yeah.
I spoke to a woman named Rachel Goldberg a couple of weeks ago in Israel. Her son Hirsch had part of his left arm blown off in a bomb shelter when he was hiding from Hamas gunmen. And he's been taken hostage. And she was on a call with you, she told me, with about 10 other Americans whose loved ones are probably being held hostage. She said that there was another mother on the Zoom call. 2 of her children were missing. She'd already been informed that one of her children was dead. And during the call, she got up, and then she came back in and unmuted the Zoom. She said, I'm sorry to break in, but I've just been told my other child has been found dead. And she was screaming. And Rachel said that you cried, and everybody cried. And then after some time, according to Rachel, you said, I know loss. I've lost 2 children. I lost my wife, and I'm telling you that you need to go through this, but you also need to remember that you will be strong again for your family. And Rachel said to me that it wasn't platitudes, that it was a real moment of a father who's lost 2 children talking to a mother who's also lost 2 children. There's not a lot of people who are able to step into other people's pain the way you are willing to.
Look, I mean, you know, I can remember the worst of all feelings I've ever had in my life, where I didn't know whether my 2 boys were alive when I was going home after I heard that accident call. And I'm told that my wife was dead on top of my one son, my daughter was dead on top of my other son. And it took several hours of the jaws of life to get them out. And what I've never been able to do, some people can, I never wanted to know the detail. I didn't want to know any of the detail. I was on a committee on transportation in the United States Senate, and the issue was about trucks and brakes. And I couldn't hold hearings. I didn't want any part of that. I couldn't do it. And I remember when I told you we sold the house that we had bought, and the house we moved into, I had moved all those boxes you talk about. Well, I moved on the 3rd floor a bunch of boxes I had never opened. And I opened one of the boxes that had never been opened. I decided what I was going to throw out and not. There were about 15 boxes in that 3rd floor attic room. And there was a scrapbook. And someone, thinking they were doing me a favor, kept a scrapbook of the accident and everything. And I opened it up, and there was a picture of the car. I closed it. I took it downstairs and I burned it. I could not. I don't want to know the detail. I'd like to pray God that car hit and they were gone. and the boys don't remember anything. But, well, I just think it's really, really, really difficult for that woman to get that news. The hardest part was going home because I wasn't sure that the message I got, I'm not sure the boys are going to make it.
Yeah.
I know they were dead or alive going home.
Just finally, because I know we're out of time, there's a psychotherapist named Francis Weller who's on the podcast. And one of the things he writes, he said, "Our refusal to welcome the sorrows that come to us, our inability to move through these experiences with true presence and conscious awareness condemns us to a life shadowed by grief. Welcoming everything that comes to us is the challenge. This is the secret to being fully alive." I very much want to get to that place. I'm not sure I can, but do you feel like you're in that place?
It's one thing to welcome it, another thing to deal with it. I don't know anybody who welcomes grief. I didn't welcome, but you got to confront it. Got to deal with it, look at it, understand it, and decide I'm moving on because I have another purpose in life. My 2 children are alive, my grandchildren, my wife, my whatever it is. It's not welcoming grief, it's facing it. And one of the things I tell people, the moment will come when the memory of the one you lost that you're fighting through, where you're going to open one of those boxes and you're going to smile before you cry, that's when you know you're going to make it. The time will come, but you got to face it. But it's hard as hell. And like I said, the thing, I mean this from the bottom of my heart, my word is abiding. I think it's critical that people understand that they're always going to be with you. Your mother's in your heart every single day. Your brother, as horrible as that was for your mother and for you, your brother, but in your heart, you're there every single day. And there'll come a time as you face up to this, and I'm no psychiatrist, state the obvious, but when you can sort of welcome that, that you have that, you had that it was there. I think the hardest thing must be to deal with your brother's circumstance.
Yeah, I get stuck in the way his life ended as opposed to how he lived his life.
Bingo. That's what I mean. Look, it's really hard as hell to figure out. I found myself spending a lot of time. What could I have done? Was it my fault this all happened? What could I have done differently?
I think about that a lot.
What could I have done differently? Maybe I shouldn't have been, commuting. Maybe for example, right after this happened, it was a Ford station wagon. I thought, well, maybe I had the wrong car. If there'd been another car, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe they, or if...
You can endlessly go through those.
And eventually what you get to is like, I'm going to reveal myself here. I shouldn't do this probably.
The president is reaching into his pants pocket and pulls out a small silver object. It's another kind of rosary, and he's holding it in his hand.
I find solace in my faith. And all the stories about how the Irish were persecuted, and, we scanned all that stuff to talk about Irish. And this is called a prisoner's rosary. They weren't allowed to have rosaries like Our Lady of Guadalupe in Irish prisons during the famine. But they had these. And I find myself, going to bed, just saying a decade, just holding on. And it's almost rote, but I feel connected to Bo, to Naomi, to Nelia. But again...
It's beautiful to have that faith, too.
Well, again, it's almost more of a feeling than it is articulatable, able to articulate the detail of it. But I just think that the time's going to come when, God willing, I'm going to see him again. And I know that sounds probably...
No, I think about that all the time, too.
It's because, look, she's in your heart, he's in your heart. I mean, you can't look in the mirror and not see her. You can't... presumptuous of me to say that.
Well, no, it's the amazing thing is my kids look like my mom and look like my brother. It's amazing.
Well, by the way, Bo's son looks like him. Hunter's son looks like Bo. Bo named his son Hunter, and Hunter named his son Bo. I mean, it's like, I know it sounds stupid to people who haven't been through this before, but
No,
there's
it's
this,
beautiful.
There's this thing. And I even find that I'll find one of my grandchildren doing what Bo would have done. I mean, literally what Bo would have done.
You see that the cycles repeat in families. You see you see in the eyes of your grandchildren, the eyes of your son.
I do.
Mr. President, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you sharing. I think you're sharing your situation with so many people. Gives them hope, because a lot of people think I must be the only one that's happened to me.
Yeah.
When they know other people are there, and they.
It's the strangest thing about grief is, it's this universal human experience, and yet it feels so lonely, and it feels so alone in it.
No, and it is, and and a lot of people aren't inclined to talk about it either. They don't know how to or want to. But anyway, I've never known anybody who hasn't benefited from ultimately talking about it.
I agree. Thank you, sir.
As my mother said, God love you, dear.
That was President Joe Biden at the White House on November 7th. I hope hearing the president, one of the most powerful people on the planet, talk about his grief will help you talk about yours. As hard as it is, it helps to talk.